In the wake of Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the Roman Republic spiraled into renewed chaos. Cleopatra, returning to Egypt with her young son Caesarion, ruled independently but watched Rome's power struggle with a keen interest. Two figures emerged from the Republic's wreckage: Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted heir, and Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's former lieutenant. While Octavian gathered political strength in the west, Antony, stationed in the east, wielded military power and popular loyalty. The two would briefly share power under the Second Triumvirate, but their ambitions would eventually collide, and into this volatile arena, Cleopatra re-entered the Roman stage. Though Caesar had never officially named Caesarion as his heir, Cleopatra asserted that the boy, officially named Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, was the biological son of Julius Caesar. In Alexandria, Caesarion was presented as Caesar's rightful legacy, a living bridge between Roman power and Egyptian sovereignty. While most Roman elites refused to recognize the claim, Cleopatra elevated Caesarion's status, grooming him for kingship and depicting him on temple walls alongside pharaohs. His presence would later become a political flashpoint, especially for Octavian, who viewed Caesarion's bloodline as a potential threat to his claim as Caesar's heir. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. The queen arrived not as a supplicant, but as a goddess, draped in robes of gold, sailing up the river Cydnus on a barge adorned with purple sails. She evoked Aphrodite, arriving to meet Dionysus. The spectacle was deliberate. Cleopatra understood that Rome responded to theater as much as to policy. Antony, captivated by her charisma, intellect, and resources, fell quickly into alliance. Their relationship was initially political. Cleopatra needed Roman support to stabilize Egypt. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his eastern campaigns. But the connection deepened. That winter, Antony remained in Alexandria, immersed in courtly rituals and Egyptian opulence. Cleopatra's barge, as described by Plutarch, was outfitted with silver oars, musicians playing flutes, and attendants dressed as cupids. The entire performance was orchestrated to show Antony and all of Cilicia that Cleopatra was not merely a monarch, but a force of nature. Once in Alexandria, Antony adopted aspects of Egyptian court life, blending Roman command with Eastern ceremony. They formed the so-called imitable liver society, feasting, drinking, and issuing decrees in tandem. Cleopatra was no passive consort. She was an equal partner in strategy, spectacle, and rule. What began as a performance quickly became real. Cleopatra and Antony shared more than mutual interests. They shared temperament. Both were charismatic, theatrical, and prone to excess. Plutarch writes that they spent days drinking, feasting, and staging elaborate games, with Cleopatra often in costume and Antony reveling in the play. Their love affair was as political as it was personal, but not disingenuous. In Cleopatra, Antony found both a royal ally and an equal who challenged and delighted him. Their banter was legendary, filled with jests, wagers, and clever riddles. They formed a domestic court in Alexandria that mirrored Rome's grandeur, but ran on their terms. Unlike Antony's Roman wife Octavia, Cleopatra embraced his Eastern ambitions. She flattered his ego, invested in his campaigns, and offered him the divine aura Egyptian kingship conferred. Their bond scandalized Rome, but thrilled Alexandria. By 40 BC, Cleopatra had bore Antony twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. In 36 BC, she bore him a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. These were not merely heirs, they were symbols. Together with Caesarion, Cleopatra was building a dynastic legacy tied to both Roman and Ptolemaic blood. Antony, meanwhile, was engaged in military campaigns against the Parthians and Armenians. His campaigns were mixed, but in 34 BC, he staged a triumph in Alexandria, not Rome. At the center of this event were Cleopatra and their children. In a ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra's children. To Roman senators, this was a direct threat. Caesarion was styled as the King of Kings. Cleopatra was no longer just a queen. She was being presented as an Eastern empress. Their children symbolized more than lineage. They were a statement of permanence. Cleopatra had not just captivated Antony, she had reshaped his identity. He no longer spoke merely as a Roman consul. He addressed Eastern rulers as a sovereign peer. In private and public, he treated Cleopatra as an empress. Their court celebrated a shared future that blended Roman command with Hellenistic divinity. Even if Rome could not accept this, they believed it was real. In Rome, Octavian exploited Antony's actions to full effect. He portrayed Antony as a man bewitched by Cleopatra, seduced by Eastern decadence, and disloyal to Rome. He publicized Antony's alleged will, possibly authentic, possibly forged, which declared Caesarion Caesar's rightful heir and requested Antony be buried in Egypt. The Senate, stirred by Octavian's rhetoric and ambition, revoked Antony's powers. In 32 BC, war was declared, not on Antony by name, but on Cleopatra. Octavian framed the conflict as a defense of Roman identity against foreign corruptions. Cleopatra, once a shrewd player of politics, was now cast as an existential threat to the Republic's survival. Octavian's message was relentless. In coins, speeches, and Senate debates, he painted Cleopatra as a corrupting foreigner and Antony as a traitor to Rome. Rome, still traumatized by decades of civil war, latched on to this narrative. The fear was not merely that Antony would bring Cleopatra to Rome, but that he would bring monarchy, something Romans had rejected since Tarquin the Proud. Octavian's genius lay in framing a complex geopolitical rivalry as a moral crusade. On September 2, 31 BC, the decisive clash came at Actium, on the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, faced Agrippa, Octavian's gifted admiral. The battle was long and chaotic. Cleopatra, seeing the tide turn, fled with her squadron. Antony followed. The remaining fleet surrendered. It was not merely a defeat, It was a collapse of morale, strategy, and political legitimacy. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Egypt, hoping to regroup, but the war was already lost. Octavian was held in Rome as a liberator. The Republic, in its final breath, crowned him its savior, not knowing that the Republic would never return. By the summer of 30 BC, Octavian arrived in Egypt. Antony's forces, demoralized and outnumbered, deserted. Believing Cleopatra dead, Antony fell on his sword. He was taken dying to her chambers. Cleopatra attempted negotiation with Octavian, but quickly realized she would be paraded through Rome in chains. Refusing humiliation, she took her own life, possibly by asp bite, possibly by poison. Octavian allowed them to be buried together. Caesarion was captured and executed. Egypt was annexed as a Roman province. Cleopatra's death marked the end of Ptolemaic rule and the end of any pretense that Rome remained a republic. Cleopatra's death was as theatrical as her life. Ancient sources disagree on the method. Some claim she allowed an asp bite her, a symbol of royalty and divine power. Others say she ingested a fast-acting poison. Regardless of method, the message was clear. She would not be paraded through Rome as a trophy. Octavian had her embalmed and buried beside Antony in the royal tomb. Caesarion, just 17, was lured out of hiding with promises of mercy, then quietly executed. His death extinguished Cleopatra's dynastic ambitions and removed the last threat to Octavian's uncontested rule. Cleopatra reportedly tried to send a final message to Antony, but it arrived too late. Upon hearing of her survival, he begged to be taken to her, bleeding, dying, but desperate to see her one last time. Guards carried him to her mausoleum, where Cleopatra and her attendants had barricaded themselves. Their reunion was tragic. Antony died in her arms, asking only to be remembered with honor. Cleopatra, grief-stricken and surrounded, made preparations for her death with the same composure she had shown in life. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian stood alone. In 27 BC, he was granted the title Augustus. He claimed to have restored the Republic, but in truth, he had created the empire. He ruled through client kings, controlled the military, and maintained the facade of senatorial authority. The Senate still met, laws were still passed, but all paths led through the Princeps. Augustus would reign for over 40 years. In public memory, Antony and Cleopatra were cast as cautionary figures, ruined by passion, lost to foreign ambition, but the narrative was written by the victors. Their story, like the Republic's fall, was shaped as much by politics as by truth. Antony and Cleopatra were not the cause of the Republic's collapse. They were its final expression. Both were ambitious, both sought legacy, and both misread the tides of power. Their alliance was not just romantic, it was strategic. They represented an alternative vision of Rome, more cosmopolitan, more Hellenistic, more imperial, but Rome under Octavian chose singular control. In the ruins of Alexandria lay the possibility of a different future, one in which Rome might have embraced a Hellenistic empire led by a queen and a general rather than a princeps. Instead, Augustus rose alone, and history was written to justify his victory.